Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into some really challenging, but I think essential ideas. We're exploring how our commitment to reason, critical thinking, is being tested. We're digging into Gad Saad's book, The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense. Now, Saad, he's a marketing professor at Concordia, known for applying evolutionary psychology. He argues that there are these, insidious forces eroding our connection to reason, to science, enlightenment values. It's quite a claim, a bold premise, definitely. And one we want to look at impartially today.
Yeah, and what's really central to Saad's argument is this idea of brain parasites. Not literal ones, of course, but certain forces acting like them. He's saying these aren't just, bad opinions. They actually change behavior, pushing society towards, well, he calls it irrational prejudice and superstition. And interestingly, he argues a lot of this originates from within academia. So our goal here isn't necessarily to agree with everything Saad says, but to really unpack these mind viruses, as he calls them, understand where he thinks they come from, their impact, and maybe explore the strategies he suggests for, getting back to reason. It's about understanding a significant viewpoint out there.
Okay, let's unpack this central metaphor then. Mind viruses or idea pathogens is a strong image. How exactly does Saad see these ideas working like parasites? What's the mechanism he's describing?
Well, he explains it as these ideas literally parasitizing human minds. They make individuals, in his words, impervious to critical thinking. He uses the analogy of, say, a Gordian worm infecting a cricket, making it jump into water, completely changing its behavior for the parasite's own spread. He argues these ideas do something similar, spreading through populations, often finding fertile ground in certain academic fields like women's studies or gender studies, according to him. And this leads him to coin a term, Ostrich Parasitic Syndrome, or OPS.
OPS.
Yeah.
Okay.
He describes it as a kind of disordered thinking, people rejecting fundamental truths, building this sort of alternate reality. He calls it unicornia. It involves dismissing science, logic, data, common sense, replacing it with what Saad called illusory correlations and, feel-good progressive platitudes, basically turning away from reality.
So for you listening, it's about spotting when maybe we or people around us are using the wrong mental tool for the job, letting emotion just swamp reason, even when facts are staring us in the face. It's quite a diagnosis he's making.
It is, and Saad really digs into what he sees as a false tension between reason and emotion. We're thinking and feeling creatures, right?
Yeah.
That's fundamental. The issue, he argues, isn't having feelings. It's when we apply our emotional system to something that really needs, rigorous logic. Misapplication.
And this gets into a really interesting philosophical point he makes, doesn't it, about lay rationalism. He argues that for big decisions, cognition should lead effect. He points to examples like what he saw as hysterical emotional responses to Trump's election or Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination, where in his view, this strong emotional reaction came before any kind of reasoned look at policies or facts.
Exactly. And that's where he brings in the difference between deontological and consequentialist ethics. Deontology is like truth is absolute, lying is always wrong. Full stop. Consequentialism, though, suggests, well, maybe truth can be bent or hidden if the consequences, like hurting someone's feelings, seem worse. Saad argues, quite provocatively, that a lot of what he labels progressive lunacy comes from prioritizing feelings over truth in this consequentialist way. He gives this really stark example from the Netherlands involving Geert Wilders, who was charged for criticizing Islam. Saad quotes the prosecutor's office saying something like, "It is irrelevant whether Wilders' witnesses might prove Wilders' observations to be correct. What's relevant is that his observations are illegal."
Wow.
Yeah. For Assad, that just highlights the danger zone we enter when truth itself becomes illegal if it offends someone.
That example really drives home his point. For you, the listener, it's about thinking critically about when an issue needs that cool, rational analysis seeking objective truth, and when maybe an emotional lens is more appropriate. Knowing which system to engage. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. The book also really tackles freedom of speech, arguing it's under serious attack, especially in universities and the public square.
Yes, absolutely. Saad lists example after example of people facing, severe backlash for voicing ideas that go against the grain. He mentions academics like Lawrence Summers at Harvard, forced out after discussing potential sex differences in STEM, or Alessandro Strumia, condemned for presenting data on gender disparities in physics citations. And it's not just academia. James Damore at Google, fired for that internal memo on sex differences, even though Google had apparently asked for diversity feedback. Saad sees a clear pattern here.
Right, a pattern suggesting certain topics, even if backed by data, are just off limits for discussion.
Exactly, a kind of chilling effect.
He even brings up things that seem smaller, but maybe point to a larger cultural shift, like the astrophysicist Matt Taylor. Remember him? Landed a probe on a comet.
Oh, the shirt incident, yeah.
Right. Remembered more for his inappropriate shirt than the massive scientific achievement. Saad talks about this costly signaling involved in speaking out, and the fact that a publication like the Journal of Controversial Ideas even exists, letting academics publish anonymously out of fear. That really highlights the climate Saad is describing.
And Saad sees satire as a key tool here, a surgeon's scalpel, he calls it, against what he sees as brittle falsehoods. He even uses his own satirical tweets as examples, things like transageism or transgravity, poking fun at radical social constructivism. And he points out kind of wryly that his satire almost became reality later when a man actually did legally try to change his age. For Saad, it shows where these ideas can lead if unchecked.
So, thinking about what this means for you listening, it boils down to recognizing how vital that freedom is. The ability to critique ideas openly, even using humor, is fundamental to a free society, according to Saad's perspective. Losing that is losing something crucial.
Then there's another big theme, the rise of what Saad calls the "I am a victim, therefore I am" mentality. He sees this leading to things like oppression Olympics or victimology poker.
Okay, what does he mean by those terms?
Well, basically, he argues people start competing for victim status based on their group identity, who's more oppressed. And he connects this to something he terms collective Munchausen syndrome, essentially, feigning victimhood to gain sympathy. The Jussie Smollett case is one example he uses.
And Saad draws a line from this ethos to real-world impacts, particularly on women's rights, which he argues are being challenged by some forms of trans activism. He discusses cases like Rachel McKinnon, the biological male cyclist, winning women's championships. Saad frames this as a kind of tyranny of the minority, where, in his view, the rights of one group are overriding another's in specific contexts.
Right. And he mentions other conflicts, like human rights complaints against spas that wouldn't provide waxing services to trans women, or a women's rape shelter losing funding because it wouldn't admit trans women.
Yeah.
These are complex situations he examines through this lens.
The book also gets into cultural appropriation and what he calls sartorial bigotry. Examples like Katy Perry in a geisha outfit or that high school student Keziah Dam wearing a Chinese dress to prom both caused huge uproar.
Or the controversies over white people having dreadlocks, university warnings about Halloween costumes.
Yeah, leading to that incident at Yale where the lecturer, Erica Christakis, effectively had to resign just for questioning the costume warnings. Saad sees this as a sign of extreme, almost brittle sensitivity.
And he links these things to concepts like concept creep, where the definition of harm keeps expanding, and his own idea, homeostasis of victimology.
Homeostasis of victimology.
Yeah, the idea that society needs to maintain a certain level of perceived victimhood, so it keeps finding or even manufacturing it. Then he really focuses on academia. He calls it, quite bluntly, both a purveyor of truth and an ecosystem of intellectual garbage. He sees it as patient zero for a lot of these ideas he critiques. He gives examples he considers anti-science lunacy. But maybe more striking are the grievance studies hoaxes.
Oh, right. I remember reading about those.
Yeah, where researchers submitted deliberately nonsensical papers, one linking the penis to climate change, another rewriting Mein Kampf with feminist jargon, and got them accepted by supposedly serious journals in fields like feminist philosophy and gender studies.
That really shook things up.
For Saad, it was stark proof of ideological capture in certain academic areas. He also mentions things like feminist glaciology as another example of ideology creeping into science.
And he provides data on the political leanings in universities, too, highlighting these really skewed Democratic to Republican ratios in many departments, like 44-1 in sociology, he claims.
Right. And he cites studies suggesting discrimination against conservative academics in hiring, in grants. He argues this creates sterile ideological echo chambers that actually harm critical thinking rather than foster it. And then there's the whole safe spaces and trigger warnings phenomenon, warnings for, slimy things, the word stupid. Saad argues this infantilizes students. It's the opposite of exposure therapy, which actually builds resilience. His line is basically, life is your trigger warning. Shielding people constantly leaves them unprepared.
So connecting this back again, for you listening, Saad's point is these aren't just ivory tower debates. He believes these trends directly shape how we all think, learn, and interact out in the wider world.
Now, when it comes to figuring out truth, especially for really complex societal issues, Saad advocates for something called the nomological network of cumulative evidence.
That sounds technical.
It sounds it, but the idea is pretty intuitive. Think of it like building a really strong case in court. You don't rely on just one witness or one piece of evidence. You gather lots of different kinds of evidence, historical data, scientific studies, observations across different cultures, different times, and you see if they all consistently point to the same conclusion. You build this interconnected web of proof.
Okay, so it's about converging evidence from diverse sources. And the book applies this framework quite directly to the ideology of Islam.
Yes, and this is obviously a very sensitive area. Saad stresses his goal is to scrutinize the ideology dispassionately, using this evidence-based approach, not to attack individuals or their personal faith. It's a methodological approach he feels is necessary.
How does he apply it?
Well, he looks at what he calls the epidemiology of meanplexes, basically, how idea systems spread. He compares Islam and Judaism. He notes things like the ease of conversion, the Shahada for Islam, versus a long, rigorous process for Judaism. He points to penalties for leaving the faith, death penalty for apostasy in several Islamic countries, versus it being rarely applied in Judaism, and the emphasis on proselytizing in Islam versus it not being encouraged in Judaism.
And the result of these factors in his analysis?
A vastly different number of adherents. Roughly 1.8 billion Muslims compared to 14.5 million Jews, even though Judaism is much older. He sees this difference in spread as significant data. Then he pulls together other evidence strands. Historically, he characterizes Islam's expansion as involving endless conquests. Looking at contemporary data, he cites FBI statistics showing, he claims, a disproportionate number of listed global terrorists and terror groups being linked to Islamic ideologies. He also brings in global surveys like Pew Research or ADL data indicating high levels of anti-Jewish sentiment or intolerance towards homosexuality in many Muslim-majority nations. And data on freedom of conscience, noting that most countries where atheism is punishable by death are Muslim-majority.
It's a lot of data points he's assembling there.
It is, and he argues this cumulative picture is what we need to look at.
And he anticipates pushback, right? He describes what he calls common deflect strategies used to shield Islam from this kind of critique.
Yeah, things like the hashtag not all Muslims argument, which he calls the unicorn Islam fallacy, saying, my friend is tolerant, therefore the entire ideology must be inherently tolerant. Or the all religions have extremist line, which he argues ignores crucial differences in scale and doctrine. Comparing, say, Jainist extremism to Islamist violence, he says, is illogical.
What else?
Using euphemisms saying Islamism or radical Islam, instead of addressing the core tenets of Islam itself as he sees them, the holy 3 M's of apologia, as he calls it, claiming problematic texts are just mistranslated, misinterpreted, and misunderstood. And finally, cultural relativism, the idea that we shouldn't criticize practices like FGM or child marriage in other cultures because it's somehow racist to apply universal moral standards.
He seems very critical of that last point.
Very. He shares an anecdote about a progressive scientist colleague who told him off for sharing a news story about an Iraqi astronomer using Islamic scripture to argue the earth is flat.
Why? What was the objection?
Her reason, according to Saad, was simply, we should be nicer to Muslims. For him, that captured this tendency to sacrifice truth for the sake of perceived niceness or political correctness.
So, just to reiterate for you listening, Saad's argument throughout this section, controversial as it is about the critical assessment of an ideology based on accumulated evidence, which he sees as essential for a free society, not an attack on individuals. Okay, so given all this, this diagnosis of mind parasites, attacks on free speech, victimhood culture, what's the takeaway? What does Saad suggest we do?
Well, he argues strongly that this battle of ideas needs active participation. It's not a spectator sport.
Yeah.
He points out why people often don't act. Things like the diffusion of responsibility, everyone assumes someone else will handle it, the bystander effect, or the tragedy of the commons idea, collective inaction lets important things degrade. And of course, just plain fear of being labeled, fear of the social justice backlash.
So he's calling for individual agency.
Absolutely. He urges listeners, you to activate your personal responsibility. That might mean, respectfully challenging professors if you disagree, maybe reconsidering donations to universities you feel aren't upholding free inquiry, engaging civilly but firmly online, voting out politicians who bend to what he calls suicidal political correctness.
So it's about taking a stand in various spheres.
Exactly. And he says, don't be afraid to make judgments or even cause offense. Sometimes distinguishing that from just being nasty or hypocritical. Engage with ideas, not just meaningless chatter. His call to action is quite vivid. Be the honey badger.
A honey badger?
Yeah, notoriously ferocious, doesn't back down. Be uncompromising in defending truth and integrity. He cites the Gibson's Bakery case against Oberlin College, where the bakery won a huge judgment after false accusations of racism as an example of successfully fighting back.
And he wants to reassure people, doesn't he? Saying that questioning certain ideologies doesn't automatically make you a bad person.
Precisely. He says questioning radical feminism doesn't make you a misogynist. Questioning open borders doesn't automatically make you a racist. Asserting biological reality, like in the context of women's sports and trans athletes, doesn't make you a transphobe. He sees these labels often just as ways to shut down needed conversations.
It reminds me of that powerful statement from the University of Chicago on academic freedom. He likely approves of that.
Oh, almost certainly. The part about rejecting trigger warnings, not canceling speakers, not condoning intellectual safe spaces.
Where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives at odds with their own.
Yeah, that really encapsulates the opposite of what Saad is critiquing.
It does. It champions open inquiry. Which brings us to a final thought, perhaps, for you to consider. If that ability, Saad champions the ability to openly, rigorously question all ideas, even the most sensitive or cherished ones, is truly the hallmark of a free and healthy society. What is the real cost of our collective silence when these ideas come under pressure? What happens if we don't, as Saad puts it, pick up that rope of reason and pull? Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Gad Saad's The Parasitic Mind. It's definitely a book that provokes a strong call to defend truth, reason, and freedom from what he sees as these infectious idea pathogens.
Yeah, his final message is pretty clear. March on, soldiers of reason, he says. Together we can win the battle of ideas. It's really a call for confidence in your principles and the courage to stand by them.
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. As always, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging critically with the ideas shaping our world.